welcome everybody. My name is Simon Levinson, and along with Allison Wuscher, our executive director, I'm the co-founder of the Drawing Foundation. The Drawing Foundation is a community of curators, practitioners, collectors, conservators, art historians, dealers, students, and enthusiasts interested in and passionate about drawing. To learn more about what we do, please visit our website at thedrawingfoundation.org. We are so pleased to be able to support today's program, Launching from Print, the 10th Annual APS Distinguished Scholar Lecture, and I'll turn the program over to APS President Cabell Hahn.
Hi, my name is Cabell, and I'm the president of the Association of Print Scholars. Founded in 2014, APS is a nonprofit that sponsors working groups, lectures, such as today's event, and awards 4 grants a year that promotes innovative approaches to the history of printmaking. Our membership is open to any and all whose research and practice centers on printmaking. For more about us, visit us at printscholars.org. Some housekeeping before we continue. This talk will be recorded and archived on our website. There will be time for Q&A at the end of Jennifer's presentation, and we encourage you to drop in comments, questions, appreciations, and exclamations into the Q&A box. So now I'd like to welcome Claire Spadafora-Bays, who is the Assistant Curator of Prints and Drawings at LACMA and our Vice President.
Thanks, Cabell. A warm greeting to our APS members and print enthusiasts joining us from around the world. My name is Claire Spadafora-Bays, and I'm the Vice President of the Association of Print Scholars. I have the privilege of introducing our 2025 APS Distinguished Scholar Lecture speaker, Jennifer Roberts. Jennifer L. Roberts is an art historian and professor at Harvard University, whose scholarship focuses on the interface between the arts and the natural sciences, the history and theory of craft and materiality, and the history of print. She's the author of Mirror Travels, Robert Smithson and History, Transporting Visions, the Movement of Images in Early America, and Contact, Art and the Pull of Print, based on her Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery of Art in 2021. Her forthcoming co-authored publication with the artist Dario Robleto, The Heartbeat at the Edge of the Solar System, Science, Emotion, and the Golden Record, to be published in 2026, will examine the cultural and cosmic implications of the EEG and EKG signatures on the Voyager Golden Record in relation to the history of graphic inscriptions from the interior of the body. Her talk today, entitled Launching from Print, examines how the study of print and printmaking can open unexpected lines of inquiry across disciplines, from circuit design to space studies. On behalf of APS, we are so grateful to Jennifer for her generosity in sharing her scholarship with us today. And of course, we continue to be thankful to all of our members, officers, and advisory board for their continued support of our organization. It's thanks to you that we're able to offer programming like this talk today, our 10th annual Distinguished Scholar Lecture. I'm delighted now to welcome Jennifer Roberts.
Thank you so much, Claire, for that introduction. And Cabell and everyone at APS and the Drawing Foundation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so it's such an honor to be delivering this lecture for the Association of Print Scholars, which luckily for me came into being just as I began getting interested in print about 10 or 11 years ago. And I've especially appreciated that the APS is a place not only for specialists who are, as it were, already evolved and entrenched on planet print. It also makes room for others to gather around the topic, to dive in or orbit around it as elliptically or as eccentrically as they like. So when Cabell invited me to give this lecture, I was of course thrilled and honored, but it also took me a little while to come around to accepting the invitation because I wasn't sure I had anything to say. After completing the Contact project and giving a few additional talks on loose ends from that research, I've actually not been working actively, at least in a primary research sense, on print since then. I'm still very much joyfully teaching my critical printing class with Matt Saunders at Harvard, and I'm still advising students in the print field, but my research and publishing has moved on to other things. 10 years ago, I came to the topic of print from an oblique perspective without any official training in the field, and now I'm apparently leaving it, my work no doubt having changed and accelerated by the encounter. My life as a legitimate print scholar has been, to use an aerospace term, more of a flyby. But what I'm hoping today is that it might be of some interest to reflect on this trajectory itself. What is the value of never quite landing on planet print, of being both less than and more than a print scholar? This humble little etching was printed in 1728 in a posthumous English edition of Isaac Newton's Treatise of the System of the World, a popular version of his famous Principia that had been published in 1687. It's a simple schematic diagram of a thought experiment that attempts to show how an object might be launched into orbit from the surface of the Earth. Imagine you're standing on top of this outsized theoretical mountain V and firing a cannonball with progressively greater power. At first, the projectile will fall just to the ground not far from the mountainside, D. But with each subsequent firing, it will go a little further and further to E, to F, and G. And eventually, as Newton says, the velocity will be, quote, so increased that the projectile would describe an arc of 1, 2, 5, 10, 100, 1,000 miles before it arrived at the Earth, till at last, exceeding the limits of the Earth, it should pass quite by without touching it. And eventually it would, as he said, quote, go on revolving through the heavens, end quote. Now, it may not look like much, but this print is one of the most consequential images in the history of science. It diagrams for the first time the physics involved in launching an object into orbit. The print visualized the profound implications of Newton's law of universal gravitation. Newton's insight was that gravity, the same force that governs the fall of an apple from a tree on Earth, also governs the movement of all the celestial bodies beyond Earth. This meant that stars and planets should no longer be considered as existing in some ontologically distinct realm. They aren't immaterial or spiritual, but physical, made of the same stuff and following the same laws as rocks and apples. This diagram made it possible to understand the Earth and the heavens as part of the same system. Gravity not only holds us to the Earth, but could also, if properly harnessed, take us beyond it. These inky lines, in other words, are bridges to the sky. They do nothing less than connect the heavens and the Earth. The diagram made it possible to conceive of traveling to the stars as well as eventually to actually do so. Okay, so granted, you may be thinking this print might be interested in the history of science, but it doesn't seem so interesting in the history of print. Perhaps that's why so little is known about it as a print. There's not much to it from a technical standpoint, although it is kind of interestingly ambiguous because it's an etching that's trying to look like an engraving. But essentially, we don't know much about it at all. We don't know the name of the printmaker or the circumstances of its publication. It has completely flown under the radar of print scholarship. But an argument could be made that this etching is perhaps the most distinguished intaglio print in the entire universe. That's because in 1977, 2 copies of it were themselves launched from the surface of the Earth on the Voyager 1 and 2 space probes. They have been traveling at 38,000 miles an hour for almost 50 years, and they are now 15.7 and 13.1 billion miles away, respectively. And you can go on to the NASA mission status page and get a real-time update for exactly how far away they are at every moment. So 15.7 and 13.1 billion miles, that's very, very, very far away. They are far outside of the planetary solar system and have broken out of the heliosphere, which is the bubble made by the solar wind as the sun travels around the galaxy. These prints are in interstellar space. And in fact, the Voyagers are now farther away from Earth than any other human-made object. So the prints on these probes are the most distant prints in the universe. If we think of print as a technology of dissemination and distribution, then these are the most successful prints ever made. If you want to know where the edge of print history is, there you go. Mind-boggling to think of that anonymous printmaker in 18th century London dutifully drawing out trajectory lines with his etching needle. How could he have known that this would be their destination? Remarkably, the Voyagers are still transmitting scientific data back to us, but their onboard batteries will die soon, probably within the next 5 years. They will then go silent to us, given over to the galaxy. We will no longer be able to track them, but they will still be out there. They're predicted to race through the vast emptiness of the galaxy for billions, perhaps even hundreds of billions of years, longer than the age of the entire universe so far. Now, keep in mind that within about 5 billion years, The sun is expected to become a red giant star and either engulf the Earth entirely or at least reduce it to a crisp. But the Voyagers far outside of our solar system will be exempted forever from this or whatever other catastrophes may befall the Earth. They will survive us all by a very large margin. When all is said and done, the Voyagers may be the last material traces of the Earth to remain in the universe, and the little etching of Newton's orbital launch bolted to their sides will be safe. So much for the death of print. So how did this happen? How did they get out there? When the Voyagers were launched in 1977, their mission was to explore the mysterious and elusive outer giant planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And they did succeed in those missions. And in fact, Voyager 2 is still the only human probe ever to have visited Uranus or Neptune. The Voyagers would take advantage of what's called planetary propulsion or gravity assist. By surfing across the gravitational fields of the planets that they passed by, they received an enormous boost in velocity, eventually escaping the gravitational pull of the sun and leaving the solar system altogether. And this is kind of a complicated diagram, but you can see each Voyager, it has their trajectory outlined. And when you see a bend in the line, that's when it goes through a gravitational slingshot, moves around a planet, speeds up, and moves on to the next destination. So it was clear that the Voyagers would eventually become a kind of arc on the cosmic ocean. So NASA asked the astronomer Carl Sagan to lead a team to design a greeting for any alien intelligence that might someday intercept the Voyagers. Sagan's team was made up of a novelist, 2 artists, 2 astrophysicists, and a writer for Rolling Stone magazine. They had only a few months to conceive and create what would essentially become the most enduring world monument that had ever been conceived. The original plan was to design a pictorial plaque, pictorial engraving, similar to the one that Sagan had already designed for the much slower Pioneer spacecraft 5 years earlier. But the team soon hit on the brilliant idea to think differently about just what an engraved plaque could be. They decided to cut an LP record instead, a kind of engraved sound tablet. Drastically rethinking the standard pictorial relationship between engraving and information, they increased the storage capacity of the message exponentially. The record eventually was able to include greetings recorded in 59 languages, an audio essay of geological, biological, and technological Earth sounds, and most famously, a sampler of music, 27 recordings from around the world, from Senegalese percussion to Mozart's magic flute to Louis Armstrong's melancholy blues. And most relevant for us today, they also included a selection of 116 images converted to sound. The images were intended as an information-dense documentary of Earth, covering technology, world culture, a rudimentary education in our numeric symbols and scales of measuring space and time, and many other things. Now, it pains me that I can't go into all of the details here about the Golden Record project. As you might imagine, it is an excruciatingly complex and maddeningly interesting topic, one that, as I have learned, takes a book-length treatment even to begin to make sense of a fraction of it. I have spent the past 5 years, much of that time overlapping with the Contact project, writing with the artist Dario Robleto, a book that unfolds from the study of just a single track on this record, and it's the EEG recording added at the last minute by Anne Drian, who was the creative director of the project. And on the left is just the cover of our book proposal a few years ago. The book is being edited just right now, and it will be out hopefully late next summer with Scribner. But I can't go into all of that today. Today, we're just going to have to limit ourselves to this. The team, as they assembled the image track, to their credit, knew that you couldn't explain human civilization without including a printed book. But which book? You can just imagine the agony of having to decide which page from which book to save for all eternity. They decided on Newton, and in the process turned this little etching into the most meta of meta prints. In describing the physics that will eventually take it off of the planet, the print takes on an eerie kind of agency and power. It is almost as if the print has launched itself off of the Earth. So it may seem that this isn't quite a print, and granted, the etching did have to go through a lot of remediation before it got onto the record. The original page, and I'm just going to go very quickly through the process by which all of the images got onto the record. The original page was photographed as a 35mm slide. The slide was then put into a slide carousel and projected onto a wall, and that projected image was recorded with a video camera. That camera translated it into a rasterized scan image at 512 by 384 resolution, essentially turning the image into a folded line that had different values of light and dark. That rasterized image was then fed into a machine that had just been invented by some guy in Colorado called the 321 video analyzer. And this converted the image into a sound wave. And this is a really important machine, actually. This became the basis for all later modem technology. And this, the Golden Record was actually the first time that images had been converted to sound. So we now have our image converted to a sound wave, which was then output to magnetic tape, which was used to cut the record. Cutting a record is in fact very close to the process of engraving or etching. The waveform signal of the image was fed to a cutting lathe, which carved an oscillating groove into lacquer, which was then, through a process of electroplating, ended up in a kind of copper version of an LP record. And what I'm showing you here are just some scanning electron microscope images of what grooves look like, what these audio grooves look like in a vinyl record. The Golden Record looks like this, except it is made in copper. The copper record was then electroplated in gold and encased in an engraved cover and then bolted directly to the outside of the spacecraft. I love this comparison where you see the Golden Record both in a so-called dirty room and then very much in a clean room as it's being bolted into the clean room before being launched. So actually, our little 18th century print has circled strangely back around to its original copper plate medium, incision to incision, orbit to orbit, back to something like the medium of its original matrix to be launched into the stars. Now, I should point out that it's also significant that the Golden Record is a material form of long-distance communication in the same way that we think about print as a material object that moves between sender and receiver. The Golden Record is a thing, a direct impression of a variety of contact events. It is not an electromagnetic transmission such as a radio or X-ray or optical transmission, which is normally the way we would think about communication at astronomical distances. So for example, when we communicate with the Voyagers or any other space probes, that's all through radio transmissions. This is partially because in 1977, the inscribed matter format of the LP record was the best available technology for storing large amounts of information in a minimal space and transmitting it. As such, though, this analog record seems quite quaint today. Still, astronomers have since done extensive studies about extreme long-distance transmission and have determined that inscribed matter, despite moving almost painfully slowly compared to electromagnetic transmission, which operates at light speed, is actually orders of magnitude more efficient at transmitting information over those long distances. So in other words, if you want exactly repeatable pictorial statements, as Bill Ivins described prints, to be able to have any chance of being found and decoded in the galaxy or some other more distant location, you have to, as it were, print them out. So it matters that this intaglio print about launching has been launched on what is essentially another intaglio engraving. Print is the most advanced and efficient mode of communication through the galaxy and beyond. Again, so much for the death of print. All right, so what do we do with this weird story about gravity, liftoff, etching, engraving, and interstellar transmission? First of all, this story compels us to think much more expansively, but still very literally, about the limits of print studies. There are prints out there 16 billion miles away. This is not science fiction, no matter how hard it is to get your mind around. Those images are really, truly out there in the cold, in the dark, at the absolute limit of human material reach right now. As print scholars, how do we respond to this information? In some ways, we're perfectly capable of thinking about the connection between print and the heavens. In atlases and astronomical and cosmological treatises of all sorts, we have studied the way stars have come to settle onto wood and stone and copper and paper. We know how the stars have settled into print. And here are just a few more images from my travels through the Houghton Library Celestial Atlas collection. Stars settling into print. But what do we do with the print that has come to settle in between the stars? Are we responsible for the prints on the Voyagers in the same way that we're responsible for the prints in our libraries and print rooms? If not, why not? If so, what would it take to be accountable to them? What would we need to do to be able to stretch our sense of stewardship and historical accountability into interstellar space? Can there be such a thing as a celestial print scholarship? Now, the whole point of the Newton etching is that gravity applies both on and off planet. The Earth and the heavens have the same laws. Astrophysicists understand this. But what about print scholars, or art historians for that matter, or scholars of the arts and humanities in general? Do the laws of the humanities work in the heavens? And if they do, how would we define and describe them? Can we launch ourselves out of the gravity well that we currently occupy in the disciplines? This is a really big question for me, and an even bigger question that motivates it is something that has to do with the role of the arts and the humanities in the world and the cosmos more generally. The current conversation about outer space, for example, is almost completely dominated by tech bros, hyper-capitalists, the military, and the STEM fields, which have all followed Newton off of the planet. Are we going to cede the cosmos to them, to Elon Musk and the Space Force? Don't we have anything to contribute at these scales and these forms of inquiry to these conversations? I think we do, and I think that print scholarship is actually one of our most promising languages for becoming part of this conversation. Now, the chance that either of the golden records will ever be found, much less deciphered, by any form of alien intelligence is astronomically small. It's not zero, but it's very close to zero. It's really infinitesimally, astronomically small. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time today to tackle the whole question of whether other life exists in the universe. Suffice it to say that it is a deep, serious, and even melancholy question, not just a topic for scoffing or escapism or paranoid sensationalism, which tend to be people's default modes of approach when this topic comes up. For anyone who's interested, my view of the matter is that if there is any intelligent alien life out there, it is so far away that we have no chance of actually contacting it, or perhaps even ever knowing about it. Regardless, I think Newton's print will almost certainly never be seen or otherwise perceived by any other being that has anything like what we imagine consciousness to be. The golden record will probably never have a receiver, but the act of assembling and launching it could, if we let it, have profound effects on us, its human senders. One of the Golden Record team members pointed out in 1977 that although there was only an infinitesimal chance that the Golden Record would be received by aliens, there was a 100% chance that it would be received by humans. We too are the receivers. The Golden Record was a kind of perspective machine. It compelled anyone who took it seriously to try to imagine how we would communicate with and how we would appear to something that shared none of our own forms of embodiment or cognition, none of our own habits, assumptions, prejudices, or systems. In this sense, it fulfilled and it enacted one of what I take to be the fundamental goals of the humanities, to shake us out of our habitual perceptions and prejudices and allow us to imagine other ways of being. It can help us see like an alien. Now, in my Mellon Lectures, I argue that printmaking already prepares us for this kind of thinking. Printmaking is a practice of self-estrangement and self-alienation. Print, in other words, is already alien, already strange. Think of what happens when a printmaker prepares a matrix, for example. They have to encode the message or image so that it can be read and replicated in their absence by a non-human agent, namely the printing press. In its status as a technology of long-distance dissemination, print is inherently about a release of the artifact into an uncertain future for unknown communities. One can never be sure whether the message of a print will even be received, much less understood. Granted, usually printmakers assume that their viewers or readers will be human, but the problem of the free release of information without control over the channel is the same. The technical demands of preparing a matrix also inherently introduce a form of estrangement into the process. For example, the fact that printmakers must usually prepare the image in reverse compels them to understand the image from a radically distant perspective, as it would be seen from a viewer on the other side of the message. This is one of my favorite prints from a celestial atlas because it illustrates how reversal produces this other-sidedness in a way that directly overlaps with the notion of a celestial perspective. This is Hevelius's engraving of the constellation Andromeda, but she is actually depicted in reverse, backwards to the way she actually looks on the sky. Now, you might think that this was because the engraver forgot to reverse the image on the copper plate, but actually it was an early modern astronomical convention to depict the constellations as if you were out beyond the Earth with a kind of God's eye or alien's eye view, looking down at the stars from above. It was essentially as if you were looking at a celestial globe. And in this case, it also conveniently prevented the otherwise full frontal nudity of the figures in the constellations, because we would just see them from behind. Essentially, this image preserves what is usually the perspective of the printmaker, this reversed, estranged perspective in the final print. This is the perspective that the reversal of printmaking produces. The reversals that are all over printmaking give printmakers a way of breaking through to the other side of things, a strange gravitational inversion, an overview effect, looking in from the outside, down from above. When I say that we should look at prints like an alien, that could mean many different things. One thing it could mean is that we should try to do more to preserve, in various ways, this orbital or alien sensation when we look at prints. I think it's essential to denormalize and defamiliarize print. And one way we can do that is to adjust the way we represent it in words, but also simply in our own illustrational methods. As any of you that follow me on Instagram know, one way that I like to study and think about prints is by making my own photographs of them. I use a very simple setup, a small macro lens attached to my iPhone, to get close to prints, usually at oblique angles with a very narrow focal depth. And I should mention that I hit on those oblique angles because as I was taking these close-up photographs, my phone kept casting shadows on the page. And so one day I thought, oh, I'll just take it from the side. And I was very delighted with what happened to the image at that angle. And so that accounts for a lot of my the style, as it were, of my print photographs. Anyway, while I was preparing this talk for today, I suddenly realized that when I was making these photographs, it was as if I were in some kind of spaceship approaching and skimming the surface of a strange planet, zooming in, looking for signs of intelligence. And here are just a few more examples of what happens when you look at prints from this alien spaceship mode. I'm not going to identify these. Some of you may be able to, but the point is that they don't quite look like themselves. From this perspective, prints become strange, and we can replicate something of the befuddlement of someone approaching from the outside without prior knowledge of what's significant about them. Where is the intelligence on these surfaces if we don't know who the artists are, or even how to see them or what we're looking at? It turns out that this has interesting parallels in the world of exobiology, and it was intimately tied to the perspective shifting of the Golden Record. Inspired by his constant quest to imagine human life from the outside, to escape our cultural and anthropomorphic complacency about the mark we make on the world, Carl Sagan wrote a series of scientific papers in the 60s, 70s, and through to the 90s that took the perspective of an alien approaching Earth at various distances. Would our own intelligence, would our own life be perceptible at various resolutions with various observational techniques at various distances? In these articles by Sagan, the Earth was radically estranged, a confusing jumble of spectral signatures and ambiguous markings that hovered between nature and culture. Note especially that at the bottom of that first paragraph on the left, he points out that what we think are signs of intelligence might not be, or vice versa. Quote, extraterrestrial life, if it exists, might be quite unlike the forms of life with which we are familiar. So searching for life from this macro lens spaceship, prints seem significant, intelligent, in different ways than they do when they're photographed whole, straight on, square to the page, emphasizing their pictorial or symbolic legibility. From here, we're trying to read the mysteries of topography or materials such as paper and ink or process. And any print history that used this as its primary mode of illustration would be a print history that would find significance in those things rather than, say, replicability. The point is that we can always shift our perspective on our own field and that we can do that in multiple ways. We've zoomed in, but we should also zoom out as we think about alien perspectives. Perhaps you've heard of the pale blue dot, which is the image that I'm showing you on the right. This is the literal viewpoint from the place that Newton's print occupied on the Golden Record about 35 years ago. Many of you perhaps are familiar with the blue marble, which was made in 1972 by the astronauts of Apollo 17. 18 years after that, in 1990, Voyager 1, which was then 4 billion miles away from the sun, took its own much more extreme version of the blue marble. At Carl Sagan's direction, the Voyager's cameras, which were mounted just a few feet from Newton's print, tucked safely in the grooves of the Golden Record, turned back toward Earth and took their last series of photographs. Here, the marble has become just a point of light. It's in fact smaller than a single pixel. It sits in a beam of reflected glare from the sun. As Sagan would later beautifully describe it, everyone on Earth is, quote, just a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam, end quote. The photograph would become known as the pale blue dot. It was taken at the last possible moment that the Earth would be detectable before it disappeared forever below the resolution of the camera. This was Voyager's last light, the last photographs its cameras would take before continuing on into the interstellar darkness where there would no longer be anything for them to see. It is the most distant photograph ever taken of the Earth. In a billion years, on the other side of the galaxy, when the Earth isn't even a fractional blue gleam in anyone's eye anymore, how might Newton's engraving be interpreted? How might it be understood at this distance? Let's suppose that some alien being is miraculously able to detect and capture one of the Voyagers as it speeds through lonely interstellar space. The spacecraft, or at least the main bus of it, will probably be intact, but the outer millimeter or so will have been frittered away by cosmic rays and dust particles. Approaching the grooves on the record, it won't be at all obvious that some of them encode images and others encode sounds. The same engraved line slips between senses, and that's assuming that the aliens even have senses at all like ours. But the point is that it's really impossible just by looking at the record to determine where the music is and where the images are. Where's Newton and where's Beethoven, for example? Frank Drake, the Cornell astrophysicist who directed the picture project, recognized this, and he wrote that perhaps the aliens will prefer listening to the pictures. The pictures will sound more like music to them than the music will. And for that matter, they may not be able to tell that the grooves encode anything beyond their own pattern, their own form. Maybe they would see it as a kind of ornamental heraldic pattern, a rosette, some kind of sacred decoration. Or maybe it's a scientific instrument with the finely spaced grooves functioning as a kind of diffraction grating for otherwise imperceptible wavelengths. The aliens would recognize, in other words, that engraving can do a lot of different things, and making pictures is only one of them. They will also find these objects stowed safely within the spacecraft, the circuit boards that do all of Voyager's computational work. These, too, it turns out, involve an intricate series of metallic pathways. Maybe this is the real message. Maybe this is the memorial. This is where we have kept our coded statements about our world. Now, although these hypothetical beings would, needless to say, know nothing about human print culture, their confusion about these intricate metallic technologies on the Voyager can teach us something as human print scholars, because they see things that are true about print that we choose not to see or are unable to see. They would recognize in ways that we don't often do that it is difficult to find any clean distinction between pictorial or symbolic engravings and sound recordings. And they'd be onto something, for example, with sound recording. Sound recording is, after all, a kind of sound printing, a way of turning sound into images. By definition, sound recording works by making a visible, fixed trace of a vibration that is otherwise ephemeral. And here you can see on the right an image showing how the sound of a tuning fork can be turned into a series of vibrational inscriptions onto a cylinder, a rotating cylinder. And on the left is one of the very earliest visual recordings of a human voice. So these images in some ways are maybe more like drawings than they are like prints. But if you want these pictures to be able to be played back as sound, you need to engrave them, produce, in other words, a topographical surface that can then be retraced. And this is, in fact, what Edison figured out when he took these visible images of sound and turned them into still visible images, but now engraved images that could be retraced with a needle and produce sound again. All waveform sound recordings are at some level printed images. So another way to think of this is that everything on the Golden Record is actually an image. It's just that some of the grooves are images of sounds and some are images of sounds of images. And then what about those circuit boards? By treating the circuit boards as a kind of print or recording, perhaps by trying to play them, the aliens would be recognizing affinities between printmaking and electronic circuitry that are actually very much true here on Earth. So let's linger on this for a minute. Surely the aliens are mistaken. Circuitry doesn't seem to be affiliated with print. It's the nemesis of print. We often talk about digital technology as the very enemy of what we care so much about as print scholars. As the story goes, the digital revolution is sending print, like the dodo, to its extinction. All the old ways of printing, including engraving, are being unceremoniously replaced by digital imagery production and transfer. But there's a very literal, blatant fact staring right at us from the screen, and that is that the circuit board on the screen, this circuit board that is supposedly killing off print, is itself a print. The circuits that run our lives, that sit in our smartphones and laptops and cars, the circuits that run the laptop that's setting this image before your eyes, the circuits that are keeping us in contact with the Voyagers and in fact are responsible for sending our ability to send spacecraft into outer space. These circuits are known in electrical engineering as PCBs, and that stands for printed circuit boards. And some of you know that I've given a previous paper that goes into this circuit argument in a great deal more detail. But just to quickly summarize, I'll just point out that this is Paul Eisler. He is the man who invented printed circuits as we know them today. And he spoke explicitly about how he developed the technology by studying the kind of printmaking that we all know about. And he went into the library of the British Museum and studied the history of the major traditional print processes in order to devise the first printed circuits. So the aliens might be confused about the difference between what we would call a print and what we would call a musical record or a circuit. This is a productive confusion. That's fundamentally my argument today. Something that both of these misrecognized prints share is that they are both what we might call executable prints. Once an executable print is made as an image or a pattern printed in the usual manner, it is also able to execute other instructions and essentially play other phenomena. An executable print is a print that is capable of continual regeneration and reanimation. It sparks an ongoing chain of agency in which prints can themselves become something like matrices out in the world, generating new actions or impressions and conducting further activity through and beyond themselves. This may seem like a totally alien way of looking at prints, but actually, perhaps it shows us affinities that have always been there, but that we may have missed. For in fact, it is a very old idea in the history of print that print has the power to propagate endless chains of causality. It stretches back to medieval theories of the commutative image and to Enlightenment models of knowledge, a series of transfers of impression in the mind. Devotional prints, for example, like circuits, also do things, provide channels for the movement of ideas and sensations and affects in and through a printed line. All of this also puts me in mind of something that Shira Brisman once said about ornament prints, that ornament prints operate in the conditional tense, that they are there to be moved elsewhere onto other kinds of objects, into other kinds of situations. And I think ornament print is a really great way of thinking about all of these technological crossovers, and in particularly the whole idea of how we speak to aliens, simply because ornament prints are themselves so interesting, and they sit right at the edge between matter and meaning, between abstraction and meaning, between simply lines that can't be understood or decoded, and something that might, in fact, produce meaning in a number of unexpected ways. Printing has long been used to make things, too, other than images, to put in rare book libraries or museum print study rooms, and has always been adjacent to other forms of manufacturing. Print can be used to do things and make things other than prints. The aliens, in seeing this, are actually rediscovering ancient affinities between printing and other kinds of manufacturing. Prints have always been inspired and derived from other kinds of making things, and particularly multiples: embossing, stamping, punching, branding, stenciling. Printing reflects upon its surrounding technologies. The boundaries between printing and other replication methods are quite porous. Oops, there we go. For example, printing is one of the various resources of mechanical art that Charles Babbage famously cataloged in his 1832 text on the economy of machinery and manufacturers. And this Babbage, by the way, is the Charles Babbage, the Cambridge mathematician who's credited with having come up with the concept of the programmable computer through his difference engine. So printmaking is very much part of his thinking. And I'm just bringing him in here, Babbage, to point out that both Babbage and our hypothetical aliens see printmaking in a much wider angle than most of us as print scholars do. Print history for Babbage and the aliens includes many kinds of printing that don't show up in museums and print rooms, that sit at the margins of what we recognize as printmaking. Many of these seemingly marginal non-art print techniques are the closest cognates and analogs for circuits, records, and other technologies, inasmuch as they are prints that do things. If we nudge some of these prints into the center of our purview, we might better equip ourselves and our students to think through the continuities between print scholarship and space studies and any other number of technological endeavors that are very much moving the world that we live in today. The goal of such an endeavor, to my mind, would be to make it possible for scholars of historical print to recognize themselves in the whole Voyager project, to feel that we belong to it and that I suppose it also belongs to us. Even more urgently, it would be to make it possible for engineers and scientists of all kinds to recognize themselves in print, and for us to recognize our work in theirs. If the humanities are to thrive in the future, they must do a better job of cultivating affinities and alliances with the sciences, engineering, and medical fields. Within art history, the history of print is one of the most promising areas for making this happen, precisely because printmaking is itself unquestionably a technical field as well as an art field. But it does require that we open ourselves to thinking differently about what print is and what it does. It requires that we open ourselves to an alien view of print. Okay.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was a talk that not only brought attention to gravity, transmission, and the cosmic scale to prints, but was a really important and moving appeal to the future of humanities scholarship. We have some questions here, and if anyone else wants to add, please drop it in the chat or the Q&A box. So Annabelle Berghoff is asking, how on a historiographical level this research challenges us to look at print studies and art historical scholarship with a different view toward temporality in addition to spatial awareness, i.e. reverse orientation. How does a method of thinking about an object as such a massive timescale challenge us to view objects with smaller lifespans differently?
That's a great question. I almost feel like the question answers the question simply by posing it so beautifully. It is something that I've been thinking a lot about because obviously, if you want to think about the Golden Record, you have to think at timescales that are completely unfamiliar to print scholarship as we understand it. one of the things that I think we need to be ready to do is first recognize that even though we deal with smaller intervals of time and delay when we're talking about prints moving across the Atlantic, say, or between two cities, or prints held in print rooms for hundreds of years, we're still dealing with really fundamental gaps in time and understanding and relationships. And so part of what this project has helped me think about is to always remember that every print that has ever been saved or sent somewhere is full of estrangement and uncertainty. We can't always know how things were received. We need to maintain that kind of level of defamiliarization, even in our so-called familiar prints. But otherwise, we also have to think on a much more, for me anyway, on a much more material level. We have to think about monumentality and its relationship to prints. We have to think about how we might go back and understand the history of printmaking in terms of the sort of longevity or stamina that printmakers were attempting to produce. So when printmakers are working in, say, copper instead of stone or lithography, these are all methods that have different time signatures associated with them. But fundamentally, I think for me, thinking at these extreme scales has made me think differently about how one might articulate any kind of message at this scale. And I feel that the Golden Record, particularly certain tracks on it, are in themselves works of art because they're trying to rethink how you would communicate, rethink the whole idea of what communication means for such a radically expanded scale. One thing I would say is that it's now quite common to sort of stuff small digital images of works of art on practically every space probe that gets launched these days. So on the moon, there are all kinds of little tiny chips with tiny pieces of works of art on them. This is not, I think, the right way to think about the relationship between art and vast scales and differences. Like if we're going to be making art that really struggles with these scales, it can't really look very much like what we've already done. It has to be taking our current technologies, taking our ways of understanding and totally transforming them. It has to be something that is unheard of or unseen, even though it's coming from our own technologies. Sorry, that was a bit roundabout, but I hope that helped.
Yeah, no, that was great. We have a question about what kind of lens you use to photograph the skies.
The skies. Oh, the skies on the page, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, do you also do like photographs of like landscapes and like larger scale or is it always just small scale micro photographs of print?
I
Yeah.
mean, I only use my phone, just a regular iPhone. So I do occasionally take normal photographs at normal scales, but mostly it's a Sandmark 25 millimeter macro lens. It's about the size of, like, it's even smaller than the cap. Oh, sorry, that doesn't work. It's smaller than this cap, this water cap. It just gets screwed onto the phone, attaches right to my phone. So it's very low tech. It's very simple. Anyone can use a lens like this. There's one of the things that's nice about it is that it's easy to bring into a print room or into a rare book library. It's light, it's easy to use. So yeah, it's very simple. It's just about thinking, you have to think very carefully about where the focal plane is going to go and what kind of immersive experience the image produces as you hold it in different ways and move it close to the image. But yeah, it's a very simple technology.
Yeah, and during the course of your talk, I was also struck by how much of your teaching style, which I know personally, focuses on looking at art in a different way, whether it's looking at an artwork for 3 hours or looking at prints differently now. What strategies do you think can be adapted in other pedagogical contexts, because it is nice to suggest that we start looking at print in a different way, but it can't be feasible for everyone who's teaching prints. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure it can't be feasible. I mean, I think so. For one, I think that my now infamous 3-hour looking assignment, where I ask all my students to look at whatever it is they're looking at for 3 hours before they do any research. When I hand them that handout, the very first paragraph basically instructs them to imagine that they're an alien landing on Earth and approaching this object as if they had no idea what it meant. That is a very simple form of immersive and I think quite radical attention that can be brought into any classroom, not necessarily 3 hours, but even 20 minutes looking like that very drastically changes the way people understand what they're looking at. And is especially valuable for prints, I find, because students and just the more general, let's call it lay audience for prints, doesn't very often have the opportunity to get up close to a print and really look at it materially. And I think that's why print is so often misunderstood as being just a kind of cheap copy of a painting, or that it's simple or easy to make a print. It's quote unquote just a print. I'm sure we've all heard that phrase. Just looking very, very closely at a print will do wonders. And this, again, this lens is not complicated or difficult. I think actually I try to train my students to not just look at prints differently, but to experiment with taking their own photographs and using those in their own publications. I think the more we have images of prints in our publications that take things into a little bit of a more oblique perspective, the better. Yeah, but I do think that fundamentally what is critical is that students understand the material complexity of prints. And so they see the texture, they see the paper. It's very hard to see that in the way prints are normally illustrated and understood.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. We have a question from Tanya Sarfraz. They say this is an incredibly rich and dizzying talk. Thank you so much. I'm struck by the grammar of mediation, inscription, storage, transmission, with which you discuss objects in this talk. My question is therefore whether you think of print as an aesthetic form or a medium, or does the distinction not matter?
Great question. I don't think the distinction does not matter, but I think that prints are especially interesting because it's a form of art making that holds those two functions in a very interesting tension. One of the ways that I like to talk about what interests me in print is that prints are both profoundly literal and also lyrical at once. It's impossible to talk about the aesthetics of print, I think, without also understanding the technical mediations that the printmaker went through in order to produce the print. So I don't think that we can separate print from technology in that sense. And I don't think it's necessary to do so. And I think precisely because there is this ambiguity about every print, that it is both a medium and an aesthetic, that is why print makes it possible for us as print scholars to talk to media scholars, but also scholars of technology and also actual scientists and technologists, because that is a kind of a shared node that we have that connects the aesthetic to the literal, to the technical, to the medium. So for me, I'm interested in print because it's both of these things. I'm a total geek, a science geek, an astronomy geek, as you can probably tell. But I'm also someone that truly loves prints for their beauty and their aesthetic capacity. And I think it's possible to be both of these things because I think that's what print is.
Yeah, that's beautiful. We have a question from Isabel Elson. Thanks so much,
Hi, Isabel.
Professor Roberts. Building on Annabelle's question, I wonder if you could consider the process of material degradation also as a process of estrangement. I was wondering, as you were talking about how the Voyager may circulate for billions of years, whether we are concerned about the material longevity of the spacecraft itself.
Great question. One of my favorite things to think about is what's going to happen to these probes over billions and billions of years. It's a very interesting topic of thought and conversation. So even in the 70s, when they were putting together the Golden Record, Sagan and others had to think about how long is this going to last, and they did various studies trying to determine sort of what's the density of plasma and cosmic rays and dust that the Golden Records and the spacecraft would be flying through. And they made various calculations, which they thought meant it would last probably 5 billion years. So they actually calculated, or tried to, how quickly the micrometeorites and dust would wear away first the cover. So the Golden Record is in a cover that's also aluminum. So they calculated how long it would be before that had just been destroyed. And then they thought about, okay, so we have a two-sided record, and whatever side is facing out is going to be decayed more quickly. So they thought how long it would take. Okay, first goes through the cover, then it goes through the record from one side. And then so that really sensitive part, the first side of the record is, which has all the images on it, by the way, is going to be the safest. That's going to last the longest because it'll take that long for all of this dust to go through it. But this is billions and billions of years. It's almost impossible to think about this. And in fact, recently, a series of Dutch astronomers, a group of Dutch astronomers took all the latest data about the movements of stars in the galaxy, and they recalculated how long the Voyagers would last, and now they're saying it could be as long as 1 trillion years, which is just like after the death of every star in the universe. The Voyagers are still going to be out there. So these are questions of decay and damage that astronomers have to think about all the time whenever they put a probe out in space. Is, it seems like it's empty, but space is actually not empty. It's full of all kinds of things that will put a ping in your solar panel or whatever. So there's a way of measuring decay. And the other thing I'll say is that this was actually part of the way the Golden Record was understood to be communicating about the time that it was launched. So one of the ways they thought, okay, let's say an alien finds this in 3 billion years, that they would actually theoretically be able to use the decay in order to measure how long it had been out there, how long it had taken, and therefore when it was launched. And so this is a sort of like carbon dating, but on a much more extreme scale. And for me, I mean, I've always wanted to look at prints that are slightly damaged. I mean, when I go into a print room, I want to see the sort of bad versions, the side versions, the things that didn't work, the prints that have been damaged, because of course there's all kinds of information in a print that's in bad condition, and conservators know this very well. I'd like to see more of that kind of conservation knowledge come to the fore in our field, where we're thinking not just about this perfect image that's presented in a museum setting, but also what kind of space and time did this image have to go through to get to us? So that's part of my interest in materiality, is not just how things are put together, but how they fall apart.
Yeah, and it's such a massive time scale to even grasp my mind around. It's different than thinking about, how iron gall ink degrades over time. It's billions and billions of years.
Right.
We have a question from Taryn. I might butcher your last name, Netman. There's something beautiful about how the Golden Record has to rotate to be read, like celestial bodies, how celestial bodies orbit other bodies. I wonder if the surface of the entire spacecraft could be engraved or cut like a record. So instead of a record object attached to the object of the spacecraft becomes a record. I'm not sure if this is feasible, but as a thought, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the crossover between print and sculpture, or print matrix as sculpture.
I love that, because I've often thought about, I think normally people people think of the Voyagers as being like the real science, and that the Golden Record is just this piece of content that's attached to it. But I've often felt that actually it's the Golden Record that's driving things. Once it gets out into the interstellar space and beyond the death of the Earth and so forth, it's the Golden Record that's the functioning part of the spacecraft, and it is in some sense driving the spacecraft. I love the idea of just having the whole spacecraft be engraved. And this is one of these really interesting areas of space science right now that print scholars, I think, should be absolutely involved in, because we have all kinds of engravings on any spacecraft, not just in the circuits, not just in whatever they're attaching as cultural cargo, which is the term now, but every part of the spacecraft is engraved. Scientific instruments, I mean, that's why I mentioned diffraction gratings. Many of our scientific instruments are themselves built through engraving and these kinds of technologies. So yes, we should just be sending the print. The prints are the ship, put it that way.
Yeah, I'm reminded of parts of Paul Allen, Microsoft co-founder's collection came to the market last year and was on view. And it was interesting to see what his personal collection included, which encompassed everything from Xerox, like the original Xerox machine from 1973, to actual like printed logs that astronauts use on spacewalks. So I thought it was really beautiful how you talked about how print scholarship can be a way that we can have a stake in this technocratic conversation right now. We have an anonymous question. Are there any other instances in which you're thinking through print or like an alien from the other side of things has influenced the approach to your wider work and scholarship?
Well, I think that in general, my scholarship has been interested in this concept of a kind of alien perspective. I mean, I've moved through multiple different fields. I tend to be more comfortable working from outside of a field, exploring marginal perspectives. That was true, even as a graduate student, and now moving to a point where I'm not even really sure what I'm doing is art history anymore. But I think that that's actually, so I think that I'm deeply interested in materiality, in how objects can store and transmit meaning through space and time. I wrote a book called Transporting Visions, which was about how paintings move information through space and time, paying enormous amounts of attention to things like the delay in sending a painting from Boston to London and back. This has been a persistent interest of mine, is that it's actually, I look at art and the transmission of art as something that's actually very difficult to do, and try to get in and disturb what can sometimes be a complacent sense that images can just pop up from one side of the earth to the other without any effort or delay, a sense that images are routinely understood by all of their receivers. I have been, I think, always trying to think about art history with the kind of quizzical view or slightly befuddled view of someone from the outside. And I think that's both why I'm so interested in astronomy, and also why I'm so interested in prints, because I think prints are inherently about these kinds of problems. So I wouldn't say that I started with print and then moved into these other kinds of thinking, but that all of it is of a piece to me. I'm interested in these technologies and in looking at images and forms that defamiliarize for us what an image even is.
Yeah. We have a question from Nora Rosengarten.
Hi, Nora.
She is asking if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between gravity and gravitational fields and the printing press's own atmospheric force. For example, Newton's print is both about gravity and a product of the press's intense pull. The airless, lightless quality of the contact between paper and matrix is something you have written about at great length. How does atmospheric pressure relate to the pressure that is the material foundation of printing?
Wow, Nora, that's a great question. So, well, I think we can look at Newton for maybe for the best answer to this, and that is that I think maybe one way of responding to that would be to say that yes, I'm deeply interested in the kind of gravity of prints. In my book Contact and in my Mellon Lectures, of course, there was the one chapter/lecture called Pressure, which was all about how prints rely upon these like fundamental physical forces, this crushing forces by gravity and other means in order to produce the transfer of the image between the matrix and the support. When we normally think about gravity in prints, we're thinking about things that sort of hold prints to the earth that are not at all about, you know, flight or launching off of the earth. But of course, what Newton showed was that these kind of gravitational forces also work off of the earth in different ways, in unfamiliar ways, in ways that seem separate, but that are in fact part of the same set of laws. And so I think for me, I'm just mostly interested in thinking about how the sort of material and physical, literal requirements of making a print have produced a kind of image that is also perfectly suited for moving out into other kinds of physics, we might say. And so as soon as we think about a print as something that's produced by a certain kind of physics, then we have to think about other kinds of physics. And that puts us, you know, into the world of space studies, or, you know, there are lots of different kinds of physics. But I think, yeah, I would like to imagine, like Newton, that the gravity of print is a gravity that is both about being heavy and staying put, but also about launching.
I think we have time for two more questions. Here's a quick question. Have you delved into the archive of glass astronomical plates / Harvard plate stacks, and do you consider them to be prints?
I have very much delved into those. Yes, I've spent a lot of time studying and visiting the glass plate astronomical collection at Harvard. For those of you that are not familiar with that, it's a collection of, I believe, 500,600,000 glass plate photographic negatives of the sky taken by telescopes around the world and stored at Harvard. That information was processed by a group of women known as the Harvard computers, who made all kinds of notations on the plates and really discovered multiple kinds of astronomical laws through their observation of those. I have been working closely with the artist Anna von Mertens for many years, who did a residency at the Smithsonian and worked with those plates. And if you want to see the results of that, I wrote an essay and did the photographs for her book, which is called Attention is Discovery. So anyone who wants to know about these, take a look at them. Are they prints? That is another great question. I mean, I do think that it's possible to think about these as they're better cataloged as photographs, but I'm interested in the way that the stars come to sort of inhabit those negatives as piles of material. They are electromagnetic transmissions from the stars that have landed on these surfaces of glass. And then from that point, they immediately become prints in another sense, in that they become kind of these informational objects that get processed and then later reproduced.
Here's a question from Grace Hanselman. Given what you have pointed out about how circuit boards are themselves prints, do you think that trajectory of thought should complicate the manner in which scholars of print tend to value digital printmaking less than more traditional techniques?
Yes, I do. The answer is yes. And I think my kind of journey through print studies, and you can see this in the Mellon Lectures, has often been to try to recover from the margins of print scholarship any number of relatively devalued techniques that are more closely associated with commercial and scientific use. So that's why I'm so obsessed with screen printing, for example, because it's the method that's generally, of all the traditional print processes, that's most closely associated with commercial printmaking. Even today, even after Warhol, and even after it's clearly a kind of high status printmaking technique, it still has lagged in terms of scholarship and theorization in the field. Certainly, yes, like digital printing, and also all of these sort of marginal but fascinating processes like office printing technologies of the 20th century, for example. You know, everything from Xeroxes to Dittos. There's this huge field of semi-commercial, semi-scientific, executable print technology out there that we have something to say about. And I think that's where we can start to intervene through these technologies, but also the old early modern technologies. This is, for me, a channel where the humanities can occupy the same space as the sciences and technology and have something to say.
And speaking of expansion of print through technology, we have one last question here. There's a question about disciplinarity. There's been a movement over the last few decades to expand our definition of a print, textile, sculpture, and more. And this lecture has been an incredibly expansive vision of what constitutes a print. There's absolutely joy and possibility in that expansion, but if everything becomes a print, is then nothing a print? Is there anything we lose through this mindset?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I don't want to imply that we don't need to still be specialists to a certain extent. I don't think everything is a print. I don't think, for example, that a photograph is a print because it just doesn't require the same kinds of technological production and also thinking. Like for me, what's really where prints happen is the direct contact between the matrix and the support, and also all of the kind of cognitive shifts and inversions that go along with that, such as reversal. So I don't think that everything is a print, but I do think that you know, circuits are prints. Like there are, in fact, a lot of ways that print bleeds out into the world in ways that we, I think, shrink away from. And I think one of the ways that we tend to shrink away from these prints is precisely their executability, the idea that they do things in the world. That's uncomfortable for us because then that means that we're kind of somehow complicit in the things that circuits do in the world. And maybe we don't want to be complicit, but I think we do need to think about the fact that we know things about these technologies that are really valuable. And we know these things because we have specialized in the history of copperplate engraving, and we know how these technologies work. We understand the kind of levels and forms of cognition that come along with them. So I don't think that everything is a print, but I think that the scheme of print is much, much larger than we have tended to be comfortable in. And it makes sense. It's not, you know, not everyone can learn all of these technologies, and that's also not what I'm arguing. But I do think that we need both people who are working in the sort of core world of historical print, not just Western either, both Western and non-Western print technologies, because we know things from that core world that we can then take out and move into other spaces. Yeah, so I guess I would just finish by saying that I don't think everything is a print, but especially with circuit printing, and especially with the way print has now become more or less synonymous with manufacturing. I mean, you think of 3D printing, for example, organ printing. Every time something is replicated today, it's often understood as a form of printing. And I just think that we, with our humanistic knowledge, all the things that we care about with traditional print, about aesthetics, about politics, about society, all of these issues need to be in the world of manufacturing and science and technology, and we have something to say.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. You've given us so much to think about. There are many questions we didn't get to, but we will forward them all to Jennifer.
Okay.
And on that very expansive and hopeful note, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again, Jennifer.
Thank you.